So we are live and recording because we are getting all these questions over and over and over again. Yes, the slides will be available in an email, and yes, all the sessions will be recording. And no, they will not stay for only 2 or 3 days active. So you'll be able to see all the sessions because we are recording. So I'm Valentin Radu, your host for this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are in one of those 107 countries. There are 4,387 of us over here willing to improve e-commerce companies and grow them during these challenging times. It's my pleasure to introduce Shanelle Mullin, which is coming all the way from Canada. So let me say a few words about you. Shanelle, she's a Jill of all trades marketer with a 12-year background in growth. By day, she's the customer acquisition program manager, CRO at Shopify, the fastest growing software as a service company in history. By night, she's a freelance writer in the conversion rate optimization space. She was recently named one of the top experts in conversion rate optimization. Shanelle, thanks a lot for being part of E-commerce Growth Summit, and the mic is yours.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for coming. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Cool. Awesome. So I'm hoping that everyone can see my screen. So yeah, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about how to optimize e-commerce retention. But before I jump into it, there's one question that I feel like is very important that we all come together and answer. Do you know how much money retention marketing made you last year? While you think about it, let's look at some of the facts. Acquiring new customers is 5 to 25 times more expensive than retaining existing customers. You've probably heard that stat before. I've seen it personally in many, many blog posts. You're also probably familiar with the Pareto Principle that states that you get 80% of your revenue from 20% of your customers. We know in general, as an industry, as marketers, as business owners, that retention is important. We know that it only takes 1 to 2 bad experiences to lose a customer forever. 33% of US customers consider switching companies immediately following a single instance of poor service. If you let that slip to 2 instances of poor service, the number jumps to almost 60%. And we all know from the Twitter memes about Susan and Karen who want to talk to your manager, an unhappy customer shares a negative experience with about 15 people, and a positive one is only shared with about 11 people. We also know, in general, that customers trust each other a lot more than they trust us being businesses, us being marketers, us being just about anyone that's not their friends or family, right? They can see through it, they know that we're biased, and they know that other people in their lives do not have as much bias as we do. So we see that 81% of customers trust recommendations from friends and family over business advice, which is not surprising. We see that 65% of them don't trust ads, and weirdly, 71% don't trust sponsors' social media ads in particular, which is interesting to know because I think a lot of marketers will see social media ads as a way to kind of leverage that trust that people have with their friends and family by showing them ads where they hang out with their friends and family online. But it actually is not as effective as we think that it is in terms of gaining trust. So in general, we know that the ROI of an existing customer is much higher than the ROI of a new customer. The effort that we put into getting a new customer does not return as much as the effort we put into keeping existing customers and keeping them buying. A 5% increase in customer retention correlates roughly with a 25% increase in profit. Obviously a huge difference. And emotions are also a huge factor. So somebody who's emotionally invested in your business is going to spend about $699 a year with your company, while a regular satisfied customer will spend about $275. And I think at face value, that doesn't seem super surprising, but you have to keep in mind that this is a regular satisfied customer. So this isn't even somebody who is unhappy with you. It's just an average baseline of somebody you have not emotionally engaged. And when you think about the fact that it's well over double, it's pretty huge. So essentially what I'm saying is there's a lot of facts, but basically retention is super, super lucrative. And I think as an industry, we know that. We continue to see that 60% of loyal customers will purchase more frequently from their preferred companies. And then in addition to that, they'll purchase more products from those preferred companies. And yet, after all of that buildup, all of those stats, I'm sure that you guys are very familiar with a lot of them, we still see articles like this. So to give you some context, this is the first article that came up when I searched for conversion rate optimization tips on Google. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it. Some of these tips are really valuable, but they are all, 100% of them, all 12 out of 12, are focused on acquisition. They're focused on top of funnel, bringing somebody to your site, and then once they're on the site, getting them to make that first conversion, getting them to add the product to their cart, getting them to continue to check out, and then getting them to successfully complete the checkout. Simplistic navigation, page load speed, time limit, limited quantity. These are all super valid, but they are all at one very specific point in the customer lifecycle. This is another example. This is the first course that came up when I searched for conversion rate optimization courses. It's an entire course that doesn't mention retention a single time. It's not an acquisition course. It just doesn't mention retention, even though it takes up 2/3 of the e-commerce funnel. So I'll ask you again, do you know how much money retention marketing made you last year? If you're like 90% of the people on this conference, the answer is LOL, no. So don't feel bad. It's very common. Not a lot of people invest in retention marketing, and not a lot of people, even if they are investing in it, are able to quantify how much that marketing is making them every year. Hopefully we can change that. So I want to back it up a little bit and go through the growth multipliers. This is a concept that I've seen in many different forms. I've actually adapted it a few times to apply specifically to content marketing in general, but it's been popularized by a ton of different marketers, so you might be familiar with it. It's the idea in e-commerce anyway, that the number of customers, the purchase frequency, and the average order value are your three main metrics, and that they can actually multiply each other. So historically, and everything that we just looked at suggests that we look at number of customers first as an industry, right? We're concerned with getting the most amount of people through our website, through our checkout process, and securing that first purchase. What we tend to neglect is purchase frequency and average order value, even though, as we covered, we know that it's important. What's interesting about these three metrics is that on their own, they are huge metrics. So many different steps ladder up to getting a customer. And it's the same thing for getting things to ladder up to purchase frequency and getting things to ladder up to average order value, right? There are a lot of metrics that level up to those. So thinking about how to increase all three of them is really overwhelming, which probably contributes to us focusing on the number of customers, right? The cool thing about this framework is that if you increase each one of them by just 30%, you can double your revenue in a year, right? So then you're not just thinking about optimizing one, you're thinking about optimizing three, but the impact you need to have at every level compounds and it is smaller overall. So just to break down the math so that everyone fully understands. So, okay, also, I was an English major, so these numbers don't make a ton of real world sense, so bear with me, but they will show how the formula works, right? So it's if you get 100 customers and then each of those customers make 4 purchases over the year, and then the average value of those purchases is $30 each, that nets out to $12,000 total revenue per year. But if you're able to increase each one of those multipliers by 30% in that year, you'll end up with 130 customers making 5.2 purchases per customer and a $39 value, which equals out to over $26,000, which is over double what we started with. So that's a lot more manageable, and it's a lot easier to optimize when you're thinking about those 3 points instead of putting all of that pressure at the top of your funnel and all of the pressure to improve your revenue on one metric. So to kind of simplify it, this is a graph from Rejoiner that I really like. And essentially what they wanted to do with the graph was to map out all of the different points that people can receive emails in the e-commerce lifecycle. You'll see along the bottom, there's new customers, existing customers, and lapsed customers. Again, these correlate pretty well with the 3 metrics that we've been looking at, right? So new customers is where we spend a lot of our time. We think a lot about cart abandonment emails. We think a lot about new subscriber emails. We think a lot about the first purchase email that goes out. And we tend to forget about or to deprioritize the emails that come later on in the life cycle. And you'll notice, just as like a disclaimer, that I talk a lot about email throughout the rest of this presentation because for the simple fact, like email is very accessible. We all have our customers' emails. We all have relative easy access to email tools, and it's relatively inexpensive compared to something like paid retargeting, which are also very valuable and valid retention tools. But I choose to focus mostly on email for simplicity. So again, you'll see that those 3 areas of that life cycle correlate to the metrics that we've been looking at. New customers is the number of customers. Existing customers is average order value. So how do we get those existing customers to purchase more? And lapsed customers correlates to purchase frequency. So how do we get those people who are no longer active to come back and purchase again? It's also important to note that when we focus on that new customer or the number of customer metric, we are putting a lot of pressure on acquisition costs. And when we focus further down the funnel and look at retention metrics and how can we increase purchase frequency and how can we increase average order value, we actually lower our acquisition costs. So again, this is going to be very accessible but not sensical math. But say you get $50 every time a customer makes a purchase, but it costs you $45 to acquire that customer. Your profit is $5. But if you were to get that customer to make another purchase, whether it was $50 or $20, by simply sending an email, which is relatively low cost, you've just increased the amount of money that you're getting and the profit that you're making from that one person without significantly increasing your acquisition costs. So when you're not optimizing for retention, you're actually doing yourself a disservice at the top of the funnel on acquisition costs anyways. So I'm going to focus now on what you can do with all of this data and all of these frameworks, right? How can you take average order value and improve it? And how can you take purchase frequency and improve it? I'm going to start with average order value, even though it is not the second multiplier, simply because if you start with purchase frequency, you're kind of sending people into a broken funnel. Assuming you've done nothing or you've done very little to purposefully improve AOV, chances are increasing purchase frequency means you're getting more people to purchase less amount of things faster, if that makes sense. So generally you want to start with AOV and work backwards from there. So I'm a huge gaming fan, specifically Nintendo. So I apologize in advance for how many examples I use from the Nintendo Switch. But they're excellent at increasing their average order value. They do this a lot through bundling. This is an example, I think a few years ago now when Splatoon 2 came out, they essentially bundled the game with the console with a carrying case, which is kind of like a lower value item, but when it's thrown in with the rest of the items, it seems much more appealing. So essentially they do this for a lot of their games and they get people to make more purchases and purchase a higher value per purchase than they would if they were selling all of these things separately. This is very similar to how things work when you're at a grocery store or a supermarket and you see all of the checkout items, right? And you're standing there and it's a lot of urgency and it's a lot of impulse purchases, but it's also you sitting there looking at your conveyor belt full of like $50 to $100 to $150 worth of items. And then you're looking at your 8-cent chocolate bar, or 80 cents probably. If you find an 8-cent chocolate bar, definitely buy it though. So 80-cent chocolate bar, and you're thinking, why not, right? It's the same principle. And essentially how that translates to e-commerce is that when a first-time customer makes a purchase, you send them an automatic email promoting a limited time only deep discount. Sounds pretty straightforward, and it is, but a thing that a lot of people forget is that you need to combine urgency with the deep discount. So for example, the grocery store example, you have the urgency of you're almost next in line, you need to make a decision quickly, and you have the deep discount of comparing the price of that smaller item to how much you're spending overall. Very similar situation with the Nintendo Switch example. But a lot of the times you will see people over-indexing on the urgency or over-indexing on the deep discount and forgetting to combine the two. So make sure you don't do that. And also make sure you're focusing on high stock, high margin products. So the case, the carrying case from the Nintendo Switch example is a really good example. It's relatively easy to make. They have a lot of it in stock. They can mark it up quite high simply because it's designed to fit with the package. So if you're going to offer something every time in an automated email, when people sign up and when they convert at that first point, you're going to want to make sure you always have it in stock, and that your margins can withstand the deep discounting that you're going to offer. Another thing to consider is that you will get as much out of this, out of cross-selling and bundling and upsells as you put into it. So unfortunately, I can't tell you what you should bundle together. I can't tell you how and when you should make those offers because it really depends on your data and your specific site. So it's kind of up to you to look at all of your data and figure out when are people buying these things, what goes well together. Should you be offering the cross-sells on your website? Should you be offering them at the email level? How big should the discount be? How much can your profit margins withstand? This is all up to you. The way that you introduce urgency is also up to you. And the more that you experiment with this and the more that you optimize based on your specific numbers, the more you're going to get out of these kind of efforts. So to move on to purchase frequency, the Nintendo Switch is back. So when they first came out with this, they came out with like this black on black design. And for an example's sake, I'm going to make these numbers up, but let's say after purchasing within a week, 20% of people who purchased this product came back and purchased these red and blue controllers. And then you have, say, 50% of people who never came back at all, and say 30% of people who came back and considered it but didn't make a purchase. So now a really, really easy way to go from 20% to 70% in a very idealistic world, but probably you will not get that kind of ROI, but is to reach out to the people who considered it or didn't consider it at all and try to get them to come back and kind of revisit what you know other people are associating together. So you want to start with essentially your top 2 to 3 products, right? Let's say you sell coffee and coffee accessories, right? And one of your top selling products is a coffee press, and you know that usually either in the initial purchase or a few weeks later or a few months later, people come back and make a secondary or a complementary purchase. A really great way to re-engage those people is to look at people who did not make those purchases but are similar to people who have, and re-engage them via email and ask them to consider those 2 products together. So that's the simple act of just showing a complementary product and opening it up to people. There's also the concept of discount ladders, where you actually offer a discount. I think a lot of people jump to this step and think that you have to incentivize the purchase that way. Whereas if it's not always true, sometimes just suggesting the product to someone can help. I know that I've fallen victim plenty of times to recommendations on books based on books that I've bought. So it does work, and discount ladders work as well. You can go, say, offer 5%, then 10% if they don't take the offer, then 15% if they don't take the offer, they don't open the email, that sort of thing. One thing to consider, as with anything, is that you should always be optimizing that process, so you don't want to leave money on the table, right? It's very easy to jump to a 15% discount when you could have gotten away with, air quotes, you could have gotten away with a 5% discount or a 10% discount. So again, this is something that you should experiment with really heavily and figure out what is the minimum amount you can offer off. And further to that, do you even need to offer an amount off, or can you just suggest the products together? So those are the 2 main ways that you can optimize your retention marketing right away. It's very easy. Set up a couple of emails, and I think that you'll see a big return, whether you're just doing one of them or you're doing both. Ideally, kind of aim to get one email campaign or one retention marketing campaign in general. It doesn't have to be email, whatever you choose, at the new customer level, one at the purchase frequency level, and one at the AOV level. But there's a lot of other things to consider when it comes to retention experimentation in particular, because as I said, to get the most out of all of these things that we've talked about, you're going to need to be optimizing continuously and experimenting wherever possible. But experimentation gets a little bit tricky at the bottom of the funnel. Whether you're in e-commerce or whether you're in SaaS, it is not as straightforward as it is at the top of the funnel, which maybe goes back to the point of why, as marketers and why in the CRO industry, we're not talking about retention experimentation as much as we could be. So here are a few things to consider. It's really, really easy for customers to end up in multiple experiments at the same time. If anyone is on Netflix, which I'm assuming many people are on Netflix, you are often in multiple experiments at once, right? They're testing the cover of the TV show, and they're testing the copy and the description, and they're testing the way that they categorize and at what point they surface different categories to you and what those categories are called. And if Netflix tried to run all of those experiments consecutively instead of concurrently, it would take them forever. They wouldn't get the insights fast enough. So there's not anything inherently wrong with customers ending up in multiple experiments at the same time. The problem emerges when your experiments conflict with one another, and then the data gets skewed, and then you're making decisions based on tests that are based on bad data. So the best way to combat that is simply A, awareness and knowing that it's a factor that you should be aware of, and B, being very vigilant about your documentation around experiments. I know, especially in e-commerce, it's incredibly easy to think that you don't need to have experiment briefs, or you don't need to have documentation, or you don't need to have an archive because you're just one person or you're one or two people. I'm here to, as a cautionary tale, it is very easy to lose track of all of the experiments you've run. It's very easy to not know that somebody else is running an experiment. It's very easy to not, in the pace that you're moving, know or realize that two experiments that on the surface don't feel like they could conflict because they don't maybe overlap on the same page, for example, do conflict. So the best thing that you can do is create really detailed experiment briefs and make sure that you're archiving all of those experiment briefs as they finish. Make sure that you're sharing them with anyone that you might be working with, whether it's an expert or an agency or your staff or a freelancer. Make sure that everyone is aware of the experiments as they're running. Another thing that is actually pretty closely related is that acquisition level experiments at the top of the funnel can affect retention level experiments at the bottom of the funnel. So again, it doesn't mean that you can't do acquisition level experiments and retention level experiments. It just means that you need to be aware of everything that is running at every level and how those things might affect one another. So if somebody is in the variant of an A/B test at the top of the funnel, the acquisition level, and then you send them variation C in a retention experiment, how does that differ from somebody who received the control and variation B, for example, right? Again, a big part of this is just awareness. And the best way to combat that is to be recording and be documenting everything that you're running and when you're running it and how everything was assigned and how the audiences that you chose were chosen, and looking retroactively at how you came to those decisions and making sure they don't conflict with one another. Another very common problem that people run into when they're talking about retention experimentation is that results do degrade over time. So I think as an industry, CRO is becoming a lot better at talking about how one person's experiments do not necessarily, and the results from those experiments do not necessarily mean anything for your specific site. We're kind of coming around to advertising that and moving away from the listicles that just list 10 experiments that you should run right now because it worked for one guy somewhere one time. And we kind of have acknowledged that what works for one person won't necessarily work for another. I think another thing that we need to come around to is that what worked for us as individual companies a year ago might not work for us now. And rerunning tests is okay. Rerunning experiments is generally a good idea. You don't want to rerun them needlessly, but it is important to know that insights are temporary in the vast majority of cases. Something that you learned about your customers, about your website, about your UX, about the world, and all of those different contexts might not be relevant anymore. So it's always a good idea to rerun experiments at every level, especially the retention level. And another factor is that it's very important to measure down the funnel. So I think the reason that this is a problem with retention experiments specifically is that people think that retention is the end of the line. So they sometimes don't continue to measure down the funnel. But say, for example, at purchase frequency, there's still AOV. And at AOV, there's still purchase frequency, right? So you want to be measuring the surrounding metrics as well as your primary metric to make sure you're not getting any false negatives, false positives, to make sure that you're not positively impacting one metric and negatively impacting the other. And that's really tricky to do as you move further down the funnel, and people tend to forget about it. And then the last one is that it's very easy to forget about incrementality, right? So there are a lot of actions that people will take on your site, whether you do anything or not. So if you think back to the Nintendo Switch example, right? We already identified that 20%, I think that was the number I used, 20% of people will come back and purchase the red and blue controllers within a week of purchasing the standard Nintendo Switch, right? Those people would have taken that action whether you sent them a discount, whether you suggested the complimentary item or not. There is no incremental change because of your intervention. So this is kind of just speaks to the importance of, in your post-analysis and when the experiment is over, that you're making sure that you're not just looking at that 10% lift or the 15% lift or the 20% lift. You're looking at what did that lift translate to incrementally for your business, and what was the incremental revenue that you generated from the experiment that you ran. So hopefully in a year, when somebody asks you if you know how much money retention marketing made you last year, you will know. And hopefully everything that we've talked about with focusing on AOV and purchase frequency will help you double your revenue without putting so much pressure on new customers, and it will expedite the process for you. That's all I got. Let's be friends on Twitter. I'm currently, my top pinned tweet right now is an offer to anyone who is struggling or wants assistance related to COVID-19. I'm doing free calls, offering free advice on clarity. So definitely hit me up if I can help you. I don't know if there is time for questions or not, but if there are, I would be happy to answer them. Cool. When it comes to retention remarketing to existing recent customers, what segmentation, data, or metrics do you think are most important? That's a good question. So segmentation, data, or metrics do you think is most important? I think what's important is that you're looking at actions. There's a lot of different ways to segment your audience, and behavioral segments are usually the most impactful, especially at e-commerce. You have a ton of information available to you, and you know a ton about the actions that they're taking, about the emails that they're opening or not opening, about the products that they viewed prior to purchasing, about the product categories that they viewed, how long they spent on the page. In e-commerce, you're very lucky to know a lot of information about people behaviorally, and generally speaking, that's where I would start, is with your behavioral metrics. Do you have any apps you recommend to offer those deep discount on add-on purchase to increase average order value? There are a ton. I definitely recommend checking out whatever e-commerce platform you're on. All of them have app stores, and I would definitely recommend checking them out. As much automation as you can possibly add on generally is better. As you start to experiment with a lot of this, I recommended starting with three different email campaigns. But as you start seeing success and as you start learning and building those insights on top of each other, you're going to run into kind of like a web of campaigns and a web of experiments that you're running, and it gets very chaotic very quickly. So the more that you can automate it with whatever apps you choose, the better. But I think specific recommendations for apps would really depend on what platform you're on and how big your company is. Cool. I think that's it for questions. Oh, there is one more question. Have you ever tested survey/polls to receive a discount for remarketing? Have you ever tested surveys, polls to receive a discount for remarketing? Oh, as in the discount is in the remarketing effort, like the paid remarketing effort? I'm not sure I understand the question fully.
So, Adam, have you ever tested surveys or polls to receive a discount for remarketing? Like, I presume, like you are asking some of the customers things about their experience, and then you offer them a discount so that based on their response. I presume that's what he's asking.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I think it's very similar to the discount ladder approach. If you can test it and see if people will complete the survey without an incentive, I think that's definitely preferred, especially because you tend to get higher quality, in my experience, results from a survey that is not incentivized. People are kind of just giving their honest feedback. So I would suggest starting without an incentive or sending to a small portion of your list without an incentive and seeing if you get anything back. And then if not, following up with an incentive to the rest of the list.
Great. So a bit of a plug here, in case you are on Shopify, we have a free app that monitors the customer retention and allows you to do customer segmentation as well. So you'll be able to track retention and to track the chance to win for any after the first, the second, or the third order, so that you can come up with personalization and increase those free metrics that Shanelle was emphasizing. Shanelle, thanks a lot for being part of e-commerce growth summit today. And if you guys have any other questions, don't feel shy, and you can benefit of the generous offer that Shanelle has to find her on Clarity FM, I presume. Yeah. Perfect. So that was it. Thanks a lot, everyone, and thanks a lot, Shanelle. And we'll see in a minute with Roger Dooley in the next session.
As an e-commerce manager, you want to stop spending money on expensive ads. OmniConvert Explore helps you improve conversion through A/B testing, personalization, and surveys. Understand that growth is also a matter of retention, not only acquisition. With OmniConvert Reveal, you'll understand segments, monitor customer experience, and nurture your customers on every channel.